Chair Hanson, welcome, and thank you for hosting us today. This is a good setup.
Craig, I'm glad you're here. It's good to see you again.
Good. Well, let's jump right into it.
Okay.
So there's a lot of pressure on the NRC these days. You have a group of industry folks and climate activists that are pushing you to move faster, and they've used words like plotting, hidebound, allergic to innovation. But on the other side, you've got this maybe shrinking but still loud group of people that are fundamentally questioning NRC's assumptions about safety. One senator recently said the agency has consistently prioritized industry profits over public protection. That's a tough position to be in, right in the middle of that. How do you manage that pressure? How do you navigate between those two sides?
Well, let me say at the beginning, I agree with the premise, right? There's a lot going on and a lot focused on the agency. And I think it makes it a really exciting time to be at the NRC, not just on the new reactor side, but also on existing reactors and radioactive materials for medical uses and other kinds of things, right? So there's a lot for us to continue to focus on in our safety mission. And you're right, the folks who want us to go faster are part of the public that we have to pay attention to, and the folks who think that we're going too fast are folks. And for us as a scientific and technical agency, the thing that we just have to stick to then is the science and the engineering, and kind of stick to our mission, which is to protect people and the environment, right? I know, and I think maybe we were going to talk a little bit about this idea of kind of general welfare, right? But if you think about these two poles, there's some pressure, I think, is folks on the NRC to think of our mission more broadly, right? To not just be focused on the safety of it, but to think about the general welfare in terms of the Atomic Energy Act, right? Promoting the general welfare is one of the purposes of the Atomic Energy Act. But it's not the only one, right? Promoting common defense and security, providing reasonable assurance of adequate protection of human health and the environment. And so we're one part of the overall AEA framework. But in a way, exactly what you're talking about, Craig, kind of speaks to the conundrum, which is, well, general welfare means different things to different people, right? To some people, it could mean more regulations because they're really concerned about what they see as the harmful effects of radiation on human health and the environment. And other folks are looking at the economic mission or maybe the climate imperative. And so for us to really stick to our scientific and technical mission, I think is maybe more important than ever, particularly in this environment also there's some amount of mistrust in government institutions and there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there about the public.
Well, and I know our members, our 10,000 members, like to hear that, right? Because they are scientists and engineers, and more than anything else, they want to see nuclear treated sort of fairly and using the science in a risk-informed manner. So I want to zero in on a word that you just used, and it's part of the mantra of NRC, which is reasonable assurance of adequate protection, right? Yeah. There's another term out there called as low as reasonably achievable. So the word reasonable pops up a lot within the context of regulation. How do you go about defining what reasonable is?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because it's never been defined in some ways specifically in regulation or in law, in part because we have to be able to allow ourselves to evolve over time. And part of the risk of becoming a modern risk-informed regulator, which we have been, means that we're taking in new information so that we can focus on the things that are most risk significant. We're coming up on our 50th anniversary, right? And over the last 5 decades, the NRC has learned a lot about what's most important to safety. And while maybe when we started in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we had very deterministic processes because we were still learning about the operations of these facilities and so forth, we're getting to a place now where we can engage our licensees. They can go through a process, kind of look at their structures and components and say, yeah, these are the ones that we actually ought to be focused on for safety. So there's that aspect of it. And then in terms of the reasonable, it's not zero risk. It never has been, right? So there's some amount of risk that we are able to kind of get our arms around that says, look, what's the real danger here to the public? And not to minimize that necessarily, but to clearly define it and be upfront with people about kind of what that is.
Right. And when you do that, you obviously get pushback. I mean, there is public engagement that the NRC goes through in each one of its proceedings generally. You know, how do you address that? How do you, I mean, is a lot of it just a learning experience for people? Are you trying to give them more information, or how do you help people in the public engagement process that are just afraid, right? That are being driven by feelings, and what you're saying is, we need to drive things by the hard science. How do those two things come together?
Yeah, the translation mission, as I kind of call it, and the public communication mission is really critical to the agency because, and I think overall, this agency has done a very good job of that, of trying to present the science, particularly the folks in our regional offices who have that kind of closer interaction and relationship with the folks in their part of the country and understands kind of the dynamics. I think our regional inspectors actually play a huge role in this, where they're oftentimes the ones who get called out to public meetings or community groups or to the local library or whatever to explain, hey, how do you look after the plant, and what things do you look at, and for you, what's, you know, how do you approach your job of overseeing the safe operation of these facilities? And we've got good people who can communicate clearly about things like, you know, water discharge from decommissioning plants and things like this.
So you mentioned it before, the sort of the general welfare argument. Is it reasonable to consider the climate mitigating potential of nuclear in decisions? Is that something that NRC does, or is that just something that, you know, the rest of the world might do, and you have to stick to the facts? How do you play that part of it?
I think that kind of maintaining our technical and scientific independence is going to be really important as we go forward. So as much as anybody in the agency might agree about the kind of the clean energy imperative that the whole country is facing and what that energy mix should be, people are going to turn to us and say, okay, nuclear should be part of that. We want to build this particular technology in this location. You know, NRC, how are you going to make sure that in that specific instance, right? Because all of our licenses are very specific, right? They're for a specific design in a specific location. It's not about the kind of broader, you know, seal of approval, right? Every technology everywhere. Even though we do have, you know, design certifications, and I think that's an important part of the process in streamlining licensing. But in terms of the general, you know, that the climate imperative, you know, this administration and through the Department of Energy has really has a very pro-nuclear agenda. You know, you think about things like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Project and the Carbon-Free Power Project out in Idaho and these other kinds of demonstration initiatives. And we're going to plug into those and say, okay, you know, send us the design, send us the material that we need to make a safety determination. And then it's our job to do that as clearly and efficiently and effectively as possible.
Mm-hmm. So just a little bit longer on the reasonableness issue, and to the point that you just made. If I'm a reactor developer and I receive a design certification, or whatever the equivalent of a design certification is from Canada, is it reasonable to assume that I'm 85% of the way there in the U.S.? Like, give me a sense as to how how you see international harmonization developing, and how that might help improve licensing timeframes and just processes in general.
Let me take a step back and kind of talk about, we have a specific initiative with Canada on the BWRX, the GE Hitachi BWRX 300. And the core of that initiative is we're working kind of almost from technical aspects upwards, I guess I would call. So as some of the viewers may know, we have a kind of a pre-application engagement process where people can send us topical reports, that's what we call them, technical reports, to get pre-approval certain aspects of a reactor's design can often speed the licensing process down the road, right? And the initiative that we have in collaboration with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and GE Hitachi and Ontario Power Group and Tennessee Valley Authority is that we and the Canadians are jointly reviewing these technical reports so that we can reach a common technical conclusion that then facilitates basically the standardization of the design on both sides of the border and facilitates ultimate licensing and approval. So the Canadians still get to keep their standards, we get to keep ours, we each get to keep our big processes, but we will have cleared important things like quality assurance program, safety strategy, classification for safety significance of structure, systems, and components. You know, big things. And we think that by doing that, we can save 25% of the time on those topical report reviews just here on the US side of the border. So there's an advantage to us in doing it this way too. And we're engaging with an equally competent and experienced regulator, and so, you know, it becomes, on these technical matters then, we kind of build that rapport. And and we've had some success. We've issued 3 of these reports so far. We've done other reports on other technologies, but we're really, you know, this is all about deployment at OPG for the BWX 300 and TVA. And so we're pushing, and there's some focus on this effort at the moment. I would say that if we can then figure out this process, then we can do that on other things. So Westinghouse, for example, on their eVinci microreactor has said, hey, we want to do what GE is doing, Canada and the US. Let's get together and figure that out and do joint topical reports on that design as well. We have a lot of countries who are coming to us and saying, hey, how do we get into this, you know, this arrangement that you have with the Canadians? And we have to say, look, let's get a few of these things under our belt. Let's get a little ways down the road and then figure out how to take this template, and then other countries can work together, or they can work with us on either this design or another design where we have a significant amount of experience. And I think what happens over time is, rather than have it kind of harmonization be a top-down push internationally, it ends up being kind of a bottom-up initiative around specific designs and approaches.
You noted that you were, you know, sort of still in the early stages of this. I would note for the record that week 2 for the NFL was pretty much yesterday. The Washington Commanders are 2-0, first time in 10 years. Yeah. But you know, there are some similarities here, right? You are starting to ramp up your activities in advanced reactor licensing, right? You've had some early successes so far, but the season is still early. Now there are people out there that say, "Oh, NRC, you know, we're worried about the delays," but is it too early to point the finger at NRC and talk a little bit about how you think your season's going to go?
Well, like any good coach, Craig, our season's going to go great. In fact, I would say that it's already going great. But
you're not predicting Super Bowl, are you? You're not. This is maybe win the division. Is that?
I'd be pretty happy. I'd be pretty happy with that. Look, I think across the board, the key thing I guess I would want to say is on getting ready for the future, right? Is talk to the folks with skin in the game. Talk to the folks who are actually going through the process, as we speak, right? So, you know, we did the Kairos Hermes 1 review. We got that done in 18 months instead of 21. The environmental review was more efficient and focused than we've had. Talk to the companies who have topical reports in front of us and are getting those approved. I mean, Kairos, for whatever it's worth, had something on the order of like 10 topical reports. We were still finishing up a few of those when they submitted their application, and we were able to do all of that in tandem and move it along. And we either issued or are going to issue that we've accepted the Kairos Hermes 2 reactor for review. But I think, in my view, that's all part of a decade-long trend of learning that the NRC is engaged in, right? And it started with Vogtle. Vogtle was the first reactor to kind of go all the way through the Part 52 process. We learned a lot from that. And by the time we got to the testing and acceptance criteria at the end, we were able to execute on those reviews and those acceptances to verify that the thing had been constructed the way we thought it was going to be, et cetera, very, very efficiently. We weren't the long pole in the tent as Vogtle 3 came to a conclusion, or as Vogtle 4 is coming to a conclusion. We learned a lot about that. We learned about what works in Part 52 and what, and what we might want to revisit. We can get into that. And then you take the NuScale review, right? And we learned that about the importance of having a finalized design and not having a moving target, but NRC internally also learned about how to structure these things, about how to focus requests for additional information, how to create core project teams so that we don't have staff changing in and out and there's not a re-education process, about how to take an application and not just move from chapter 1 to chapter 10, but actually start on what we think is most important, maybe chapter 5, and then bring in the other stuff so that we can structure and schedule that review in a more efficient way. And all of that learning that you're seeing is then being applied to the next thing. And so, I don't know what you call that. Maybe we've been on a kind of a 10-year development plan that is now leading us to, if we're not 2-0, maybe we're 1-0 so far.
Let's call it in-game adjustments.
We're making in-game adjustments, and we're going to continue to do that.
Right.
And so I'm very optimistic. We've got fuel cycle facilities for the first time in front of us in 30, 40 years
right.
For some of this stuff. That's going to, we're going to revisit some of that, but I think we're also able to focus this stuff as well. Really focus the RAIs and make sure yet that it's still transparent, right? That everything ends up on the record, the public can see it all, et cetera. So
as an example of that, the emergency planning zone finding from NRC, that was kind of a big deal. How is that, how has that impacted the way NRC does business? How much of an in-game adjustment was that for you? I mean, was it, is that a big deal?
I think it is. But a couple of points about that. One is that, look, the staff did that work, right? They handed it to the commission. The commission voted on the proposed rule, that we went out back for comment, and they came back with a final rule that, in my view, it was reflected at least in my vote and the commission's vote, that was a very reasonable framework. Really looking at, really taking the EP process and risk informing that, and still allowing, the NRC is not the center of the universe on a lot of this stuff, right? You and I both know, and others will know, that state governments, local governments, other parts of the federal government also can have a role to play, just, in zoning and site approval and other kinds of things. And so this framework keeps us focused on our safety mission, but allows these other things to kind of happen as well.
So are you willing to talk about timeframes with new reactor licensing, design, certification, when everything is up and running right? Do you have expectations about how long that process should take for the vendor?
Well, here's, maybe, I think is the answer, right? So I can have expectations for that, but I want to be careful about it too, because what's critical here is, I guess what I've said, Craig, all along is, with the right pre-application engagements, right, those technical reports I was talking about, and a high-quality application, the NRC can perform an efficient and effective and timely review. And I think that's worth repeating, because the input here is really critical, right? We've had the right engagements up front so that people know what to expect. So that people understand, applicants understand our processes. So I have hopes for the timing of some of these things, but I also don't want to get ahead of the staff because I don't want to short circuit that.
Right.
So yes, do I think that we're going to continue to learn from these things, and do I think that timeframes are going to get shorter as we go along? Absolutely, I do. I think as we see nth of a kind, and I would expect that later this month when we publish the schedule for the second Kairos review, that people will see that on both the safety side and likely the environmental side as well. Yeah, but again, a lot of this is going to be design, company, and situation specific, and I hesitate to kind of put a stamp on that.
It takes two to tango.
Sure does.
And you need a good dance partner.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when people look at historical delays or worry about delays in the future, to what extent is that something that's driven by the Administrative Procedures Act and just being a government agency that makes things slower? Is there some of that too that you're invariably fighting against as part of this process?
Yeah, I don't know if we're fighting against it, right? I mean,
it could be a headwind. It can be a headwind.
It can be, yeah, right, because we have to, but if you think about the point of the Administrative Procedures Act, or even in the National Environmental Policy Act, those are often their process laws, and what do? Well, they're process laws that make agencies take a pause and get input from the public about these things, and to ensure that our processes and our decisions are transparent and reasonable, right? That they're not arbitrary and capricious, for example, or other kinds of things.
All right, Part 53. So
yes.
Congress some number of years ago told the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that it needs to promulgate a technology-neutral advanced reactor standard by 2027. So how do you think it's going? And maybe you can describe, I'm looking for the right metaphor to describe where we are in this process, because obviously there have been some proposals that have been put forth by the staff. There have been a lot of interactions from the public regarding those drafts. We still have, 4 years left to meet your statutory deadline. What does it look like from your perspective? Are things, it can be messy, but do you feel like it's on track?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit and kind of talk about where I think the staff has kind of come from here. When I first came onto the commission, I think we had the paper in front of us that was kind of the proposed rulemaking plan for Part 53, and the staff had proposed maybe doing, going through some other administrative steps before they got really rolling on this. And the commission came back and said, no, we think you can dive right into this. We think you ought to take an iterative approach with a lot of interaction with stakeholders, and give us something in 2 years. But quality is important here, and so if you need a little extra time, kind of go for it. That was kind of the broad thing. And so the staff, they moved forward, had a lot of public meetings, a lot of feedback, even though it was kind of not like we did other things, right? They did something new, they did it different, they did it in a different way, and they did it reasonably quickly. Now, the other thing that the commission has said over time is there's a whole set of policy statements that the staff felt like they needed to adhere to, right? The advanced reactor policy statement, use of probabilistic risk assessment, and a whole bunch of other things that the staff looked at that and said, okay, we're getting this feedback from stakeholders, and we've got this previous direction from the commission. Let's put all that together, move the agency forward. And what did they do? They had, they came up with 2 frameworks, really in response to stakeholder comments, right? Where industry folks said, no, look, we still, for folks who are, we're going to have companies at different points in the design life cycle, different maturity, et cetera. So we need a variety, we need some flexibility here. And staff said, okay, look, we're going to try and develop a technology neutral Part 50 and 52.
Right.
That was framework B, right? And then framework A was, okay, well, you've got probabilistic risk assessment, what's sometimes called the rationalist approach to regulatory development in framework A, which is really a step forward kind of for the agency. So the staff said, okay, look, in the time that we have, commission, here's this this thing. But I don't know that the staff should necessarily, I don't think they should be, kind of beaten about the head and shoulders
right.
because we did what we told them to do.
Right.
They did what we told them to do. So I think that's really important. I've said, I think you've heard me say multiple times, we're in the middle of the process, right? The staff sent us a draft proposed rule. It's in front of the commission. I'm working on it. I know all the commission offices are working on it. I think, as folks know out there, they're focused on this. We're trying to balance a lot of different things, right? Mm-hmm. Move the agency in some of these more rationalist directions. Think hard about some of the policy issues that were presented, like the balance between flexibility and predictability. Right. You know, we heard a lot of feedback, and I took this very seriously. You know, folks came in and said, look, if it's not flexible enough for all of these different technologies that are out there, nobody's going to use this. Well, I think the opposite risk is equal to that, actually, which is that if it's not predictable enough, that nobody's going to use it, mm-hmm. right? Because nobody wants to be in a position with the staff of where, well, everything is acceptable, but you don't, you know, anything can be acceptable, but nothing is actually prescribed, or even in terms of the process. So I think we still have to figure out how to get that balance right.
So sort of keeping on the flexibility discussion for a second, again, you still have a number of years to meet your statutory obligation. Mm-hmm. Do the commission and the staff have the flexibility to do a couple of turns on this? I mean, I don't have, you know, I don't profess to know exactly how it could play out and what the limitations are, but you can go back and forth with the staff on this. This is an ongoing process, and even on the sort of the policy area where the commission has given the staff some overall policy direction, mm-hmm. that can continue to be tweaked as you move forward too. So in other words, mm-hmm. we're not locked into okay, here's the rule, and then it's going to go through the notice of proposed rulemaking. Like we're not going down that final slide yet. Is that an accurate depiction of where you think we are?
I think that's true. Remember that all the folks that are moving in the near term, they're using our existing frameworks, right? They're using parts 50 and 52, and they're working with us to go through those and say, here's what's relevant to us and here's what isn't. That's one of the technical reports, actually, that we get from a lot of prospective applicants, actually, and say, look, here's what we think applies to us, here's what we don't. And we have some back and forth on that. We settle on it, and then we can kind of start that review. And in terms of, so not having a Part 53 isn't an impediment at the moment for folks who want to go out and deploy, say, in the next 5 to 10 years even, right? Because the Part 53 is going to come a little bit after that, and it'll be available. And it could be that folks that are using the existing frameworks now, they'll use Part 53 down the road for, say, nth of a kind, or even a new design that they might have.
But it's an option, right? It's not an option. Like 50 and 52 don't close off at some point.
Absolutely.
I mean, it has to, somebody has to believe it's going to work better.
Right. Yeah. And the folks who are going through this now, they're developing the roadmaps that people who come after them can then use. So
kind of wrapping that up, using the football analogy, what quarter of the game are we in on Part 53?
Oh, I would say we're at the end of the first quarter, probably.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah. Because, you know, look, there's going to be a lot of interaction yet to go on this, and a lot of public comment, and a lot of feedback on the feedback that the commission gives the staff.
Right.
So
I want to shift a little bit to workforce. So mm-hmm. I get an opportunity to see, CEOs of nuclear supply chain companies to walk through our exhibit hall when we do our utility working conference, mm-hmm. and I tend to ask them, what's the biggest, what's the thing that keeps you up at night? What's the issue that does? And almost 2 to 1, the answer is the inability to be able to hire qualified people to build out your workforce and to expand and scale. So it's sort of a softball question, because I think I already know the answer. Is that a problem for you, Mr. Chair? How is that? How are you working through that when there's such a competition for talent in the country?
Yeah. Look, I mean, it is absolutely an issue for us. We are the competition for talent is incredibly intense in the nuclear sector right now. And when I have the opportunity to speak in public or to speak to students, we have a mission that's unlike anything else in the nuclear kind of ecosystem, right? Serving the public, getting to represent the United States internationally, getting to lean in and work on and evaluate these new technologies. And so I try and public service is a special mission. I know it gets a lot of it gets kind of a bad rap these days in the current political environment. But I still think I still think it's also a noble calling, and maybe not everybody does it for their whole career, but I think it's really worth doing for public services is really worth doing for a period of time. And we're using all of the flexibilities that are available to us, and we're talking to Congress all the time too about what kind of additional flexibilities can we get. So right now, while we may not have a lot of extra flexibility around, say, for instance, pay, being public servants, we do have some flexibility around work location and work schedule. So, telework or hybrid work can be a selling point for
us. Do you have flexibility on that? Do staff? How are you handling the whole hybrid work environment thing with your current staff now?
Yeah. Well, we came back, into the office almost 2 years ago now, right? It was November of 2021, and then Delta hit, and then we kind of started that process again in April of 2022, where we were back in the office 2 days a week, and we've been in that similar posture, but we've really been evaluating that. We've been basically engaged in kind of an 18-month-long pilot project to see how that works. And what we've really discovered is that it's not about a particular number of days in the week. It's what you do with those days, right? And so we've developed this framework that we call, presence with a purpose. I think folks have heard this, where, folks in our office, it's becoming much more about people coming together to maybe get certain projects done, right? Establishing project teams, and maybe everybody's in the office for a week because you've got to deliver a product or a project, and that's the best way to do that. And we're trusting our managers and our staff to figure that out. There's a certain amount of in the office that we have to do as public employees, and the logistics and the rules around that. But I think we're trying to be very deliberate and purposeful about how we're asking people to come in, why, et cetera. And I think overall, folks in the agency have been pretty receptive to that kind of framework.
Do you find that it's a recruiting benefit when you're going? Because I know you guys are out. You have a quota or a target of the number of people that you want to try to hire here in the next, I guess, year.
Yeah.
And I know it can be a challenge. Does it help? And what else helps?
Yeah, no, it really does. As you led into there, we were trying to hire 400 people. That's really up to the levels that Congress has funded us at. For the calendar year, we're at about, the goal was 400, we're at about 235 at the moment. It's a set of muscles that we haven't exercised in this agency in a long time. Remember, up until 2019, 2020, we were still continuing to shrink the agency commensurate kind of with the workload. And it's really, right about the time everybody got excited about nuclear again, the pandemic hit. But here's a fun statistic for you, actually. We found that for jobs that are advertised for remote work or hybrid work, we get an 18% increase in women and minority applicants. So where we're trying to risk inform, and we really need that diversity of experience and that diversity of thought as we move forward, that is a significant selling point for us.
Right. Well, it helps you reach people that may not be able to come to One White Flint every day.
Exactly.
Yeah. So along the same lines, I think you know this, back 15 years ago, it used to be that NRC, the Partnership for Public Service, does their annual reviews of agencies and the best places to work in the federal government. NRC was, I think, for at least a few years, number one, at least in its cohort. That was 15 years ago. If you look now, I think the last one was sort of, maybe lower third. A lot of that happened before you got here, right? So you're sort of there to kind of, pick up the pieces. But talk a little bit about what your challenge is and how you're addressing that, the sort of the culture and the morale of the organization.
Yeah, no, I recognize that. I think, reviewing history a little bit here is good, right? Back 15 years ago, we were in the middle of the first Renaissance. I don't know what we want to call it. We issued, I think, something on the order of 30 early site permits. We did 10 or 12 combined operating licenses. And so there was a lot of activity and a lot of excitement. And then, as we all know, we got to that kind of the height around 2013, 2014, and that wasn't going to materialize for a whole bunch of external factors. And so the agency needed to shrink. We were up at 4,000 people. We were hiring a lot. There were lots of professional development opportunities, growth opportunities for people to get promoted, and so on and so forth. We narrowly missed a layoff in there in the 2017, 2018 timeframe. We had a lot of cost-cutting measures, et cetera. And as I said, just about the time the excitement, we kind of reached the bottom of that and the excitement started to build again, well, then we had the pandemic and people were really worried about their families. We did ask, we started to try and do reentry, but that was a point of frustration for people because they were coming in 2 days a week, but into kind of empty offices, and they were sitting on Zoom meetings that they could have been on at home and closer to daycare and other needs. And so, I recognize this, and it is a significant challenge, but it's one that I'm committed to and I work on every day, and that is to build a culture of high confidence and high trust as we are continuing to emerge out of the pandemic and as we really face the dynamic environment that we have. And what I mean by high confidence and high trust, high confidence for me is on a couple of different ways. It's confidence in our abilities to make technical decisions, but also confidence in the breadth and depth of the expertise in the agency over the last 50 years so that we know what's most important for safety, right? So that we can continue to risk inform, we can take the right kinds of risks organizationally, right? And high trust is trust between the staff and senior managers to lead us through this and to make the right kinds of decisions, trust by senior managers that the staff is going to continue to be dedicated to the mission, and we're going to put that front and center in terms of protecting people. And the staff trust amongst themselves that they can rely on their coworkers to help out, to transfer knowledge when they need to jump in and help with a project, et cetera. And we have all the ingredients for that. And I think it's just it's important every day that people hear from me and from the rest of the commission how important they are for this agency to move forward and to continue to accomplish the mission in the future and to deal with all of the changes that are going to come our way.
Right. So part of this is like in all of the nuclear industry, as we joked before we roll tape, right? There's a bimodal distribution of people in the nuclear field right now. And there's a lot of knowledge transfer that needs to occur between that older generation that's approaching the retirement. Some people call it a gray tsunami. What does NRC do to ensure that you are having the knowledge transfer? And I guess the other part of this too is not all knowledge transfer is good, right? Sometimes knowledge transfer is, well, this is the way we've always done it when it could be done in a new way. How do you sort of balance the innovation versus knowledge transfer and managing the demographic shift within the commission?
Yeah. So some of that is I think about it as mechanical, right? We've got websites and other ways to kind of capture knowledge. Another way is by using folks that have retired from the agency but are willing to kind of come back and work part-time. And a lot of what they do is help out on projects where they can kind of review the history with folks and go through some of these processes. Sometimes the history, even if you don't want to repeat it, is worth learning, right?
Right.
On these things, and our what they call rehired annuitants are critical to that. So it's an ongoing challenge. The commission asked the staff for a knowledge management kind of strategic plan. What are the major goals? What are the strategies for accomplishing those goals? What are the objectives? How do we know that we're getting there? We're going to get that sometime this fall. We'll have an opportunity to review it and kind of provide some feedback to the staff. But it is really becoming a central element of our work. But you're right. I mean, 24% of the agency is over the age of 60. Another 20 or 30% is over the age of 50. Myself, in that case, myself included. But we've got folks that are going to be eligible to go off to a well-earned retirement. We've got to think about how to capture what's in their brains.
Right. So in terms of the scale up, is the limiting factor just the challenge in identifying people to hire and build out that workforce? Or is there still a hesitancy because of what happened 15 years ago and the subsequent rise and decline of the workforce? What's the limiting factor here in your ability to grow staff?
Well, I will admit to some amount of hesitancy, right? The staff, it was really hard for the staff to grow and then to come back down again. And so there's some hesitancy about going up that roller coaster. But also, we understand the challenge of the work in front of us. And I've said to staff multiple times, right, that we should absolutely rejuvenate our hiring mechanism, and we should be shaking the bushes for early career folks, mid-career folks, more senior experienced folks, again, focused on getting the right skill sets. And we've got a strategic workforce planning process that identifies, so we can target those hiring efforts. But I've also routinely said, look, we may not be able to hire our way out of this situation. So we're going to have to think about how we do our jobs differently, right? Thinking about how to really focus our processes and streamline them where we can, right? Not sacrificing safety, but really thinking differently about our work, how to use technology differently. Artificial intelligence, we're having a workshop, I think, on that tomorrow, about how the industry may propose to use that and come to us with some of those applications. But there may be an opportunity for us to use it internally as well, and some machine learning and other kinds of things, to let technology be kind of the force multiplier.
Right.
Because we don't want that to be the constraining factor.
Right.
On this stuff.
Yeah. So I want a couple of, I don't want to call them personal questions, but more targeted at you. Mm-hmm. So first of all, you've been in the job now for 3 years, and do you know the months and the dates? Do you count? Do you count?
Well, I joined in June of 2020, so I think we're coming up on 3 years and 3 months or so. Okay. Yeah, something like that.
So anytime you take a job like this, there's usually one or two things that you totally weren't expecting when you came into it, right, as part of the job. Is there something that surprised you about the job based on what you thought it was going in and what you actually see it is now?
Oh boy, it's interesting. I don't think I had as much of an appreciation for NRC's international mission and the importance of that. I knew they did a little bit. I had some idea. But the more I've learned, it has really become one of the focuses of my tenure, because the challenges that the U.S. faces, we were talking about staffing, for example. When I meet my counterparts overseas, we're all having that same conversation about how to get people in and about, young people trying to choose between public service and so forth, about how we do our reviews. My phone is ringing off the hook from countries that are thinking about U.S. technology, and they want to learn from the NRC. Some of that just process stuff about how we go through these reviews, but some of it about the substance. Why did we reach the conclusions we reached, et cetera? And that's Africa and Europe and Southeast Asia and all kinds of places. I think I didn't necessarily, I'd heard that, NRC is the gold standard, but you don't really appreciate that until you have an all-hands meeting in Poland or Ghana, and people want to hear from us. The broader vision, which I can do, but also on the, on document management protocols for safety reviews, there's just this huge appetite. and the credibility of the agency is really important, and it's something that I've just taken really seriously about how to bolster and preserve that, and how to meet the demand. You know, we've expanded the international program, and that's not us drumming up business. That's just us answering the phone.
Right. Well, and that is, to your point, I mean, there is a whole of government approach when it comes to the U.S.'s outward-facing activities in global nuclear markets.
Yeah.
I would imagine there's a fair amount of coordination with other agencies and the interagency here in the U.S. Is that more complicated than you thought, or is it as you expected it to be?
No, it's about how I expected. You know, I had some experience with the Department of Energy and with the National Nuclear Security Administration, and so I had some contacts there. You know, working with the State Department may be a little new, but overall, it's been a real pleasure, and they really appreciate what we do, and whether that's on export licenses or what they call safety diplomacy, right, where maybe the other parts of the U.S., a bilateral relationship with another country are complicated, but we can come together and talk about nuclear safety, and I'm happy to kind of play that role and so forth. And it's a great honor to go out and represent the country with interagency counterparts and play that role.
Yeah. So you've had, in addition to all the pressure, you've had a fair amount of success in your first term. So talk to me a little bit about how you see your successes, and what are the things that you would point out that you're particularly proud of during your tenure?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I think when I came in, I had what I called the 3 A's, right? Advanced reactors, accident-tolerant fuel, and academic programs. And on advanced reactors, certainly Part 53 was going to be one of the big priorities, but also the other things that go around Part 53. So, you know, we talked about the emergency planning rule, the siting guidelines. We have the advanced reactor generic environmental impact statement still in front of the commission. I'd love to get that done. Physical security rulemaking, all of these other things that kind of also go right along with Part 53 and kind of enable that. And I've been really pleased with the way the staff has handled advanced reactor license applications and technical reports under our existing framework. I think Kairos is a really good example of that, of the staff leaning in, and along with a lot of other, I think, pretty positive interactions. You know, even though maybe folks want to talk about us a little bit as an impediment, we've got 15 companies that have come to us for pre-application engagements and who tell us that they're going to, you know, submit combined licenses. So we can't be that big of an impediment with that kind of business coming through the door. On accident-tolerant fuel, specifically, I think we've made some good progress, but I just use that as kind of a shorthand for thinking about how to use technology and continuing to risk inform our processes for the existing fleet, right, while we maintain safety. And so I was really pleased that the commission weighed in on some digital INC issues to further risk inform that process. Again, with the idea of not being an impediment, how we continue to improve our processes, you know, really, again, having that confidence to make risk-informed decisions based on, you know, 5 decades of overseeing the existing fleet. And the last thing was academic programs. And on academic programs, it's just, you know, I'm getting out to visit universities. Some of that's, you know, talking to students, which is, as you know, is just a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
But it's also looking at the research capabilities that are out there and visiting test reactors and seeing how those facilities are being used for innovation. I'm hoping to get down to, you know, just by way of example, I'm hoping to get down to Abilene Christian later this year and see the next project and understand what they're doing. We've got that application in-house. And, you know, one of the things I've admired for a long time about ANS is just the way you guys support students. I met with the nuclear engineering student delegation just last week, as they're developing their paper and having this experience in Washington, which I think is really fantastic to get them acclimated. I went down to University of Puerto Rico, which is, as you know, is like, his one ANS best student chapter section.
Right.
And that's a university, they've got a great engineering school, but that's a university without a nuclear engineering program.
Exactly.
So the way we dove in on that at the NRC was, we said, well, we had helped them develop a nuclear engineering curricular sequence, kind of like a minor for nuclear engineering down there, probably 10 years ago. But then the agency got smaller and it was never implemented. Well, we're coming back around then to support. They've got 400 students in the ANS chapter down there, as you know, right? It's just a ton of enthusiasm.
You could meet your hiring goals just by hiring the Puerto Rican student section.
It's true. But what we did, we took a couple of people and we have them actually teaching that curricular sequence, NRC employees that have been kind of detailed to that purpose to support them.
Which really kind of comes back to, sort of the meta challenge here, which is how do you build that team of the future for the NRC? And in many ways, probably one of the best things you can do is take them right off the tree, right? Help support those educational programs that define students that have an interest in this field, feed that interest, and then provide them opportunities. I'm assuming that's sort of part of your strategy for recruitment.
Absolutely, yeah. Because what do we have now? We've got 2 NRC folks, really smart, down there teaching. They're building those relationships with the students, supporting the NRC, but also, providing this broader function. I'm really enthusiastic about it. If I could, underlying these kind of 3 priorities for me is just also the commission really leaning in and clearing the backlog of commission papers. I actually really appreciated the letter that ANS sent to Capitol Hill in response, I think, to Chairman Duncan's kind of solicitation of interest about, how could the NRC improve? And I think the example that ANS gave was the decommissioning rulemaking and how long that took, right? And rulemaking can take a while, right? If you think about, we develop the regulatory basis and the staff writes the rule and so forth and so forth. And some of that is to meet these requirements that we talked about, NEPA and Emergency Administrative Procedures Act. But then once it gets to the commission, my view is it really deserves a timely, hard look from the commission. Doesn't mean we have to accept it, and redirection back to the staff. But in that case, it added 3 years to the timeline. Right? That paper came up in 2018. The commission didn't finish voting on that until sometime in 2021. And I'm committed to working with my colleagues to work that backlog down. And whether it's rulemakings or other policy positions or other kinds of issues, right? We've got a proposed rule that's been sitting out there since 2017. And boy, I'd love to get that, whether we approve it or disapprove it or whatever. I think the staff deserves a timely response. And if we want the staff to be more efficient and to feel the urgency, well, I think the commission has to kind of lead by example. And that's really important to me. When I first came onto the commission, we had about 50 papers that were kind of outstanding. We talked about this back in 2020. We're down to about 40, but 40 still feels like a lot.
Right.
I voted on about 20 or 21 of those. I'm committed to kind of continuing to work with my colleagues to just settle some of this stuff so that we can focus on the big things that really matter. Not all papers that come before the commission are created equal, and each commissioner has their own priorities. I certainly understand that, but at some point, the priorities need to converge, and I really hope that we can do that working together going forward.
Fewer, more important things is what
Absolutely.
I heard.
Yeah. It's like, was it Stephen Covey, right? You want to be in the quadrant that is important and not urgent. Right. As a policy setting body, that seems like a pretty good place for us to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and let me just, I'm going to pull the thread a little bit on it, because you mentioned before about flexibility, right? And there's always a debate about should things be in the rule or should they be in guidance?
Yeah.
And that gets back to this larger argument where you want to, a level of certainty, the right amount of certainty and flexibility.
Yep.
Are those the sorts of, are you presented with those choices every day?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But I've been impressed with the staff in terms of the flexibility that they've been able to demonstrate on some key things where if industry comes to them and says, look, we'd like to propose this approach, we'd like you to evaluate this approach because we'd like to do it this way, maybe going forward on some things. And I've been pleased with the staff's openness on that stuff. I think we're starting to see that on some of the subsequent license renewal reviews about, kind of classifying information about what do we really need to look at for that next 20 years versus, what's more confirmatory, et cetera.
Well, one other question, oftentimes regulators it can feel like they're in a bubble, right? Because there's always this line between the regulator and the regulated. And so, in a way, that bubble is there for a reason, but it's also important to have context about what's happening in the industry and how do you balance for your staff? How do you balance that need for independence with the need for a current understanding of the context of what's going on in the industry? Do you send them to meetings? Does it all happen here within the walls of NRC? How do you make sure that your staff is independent but connected to what's going on?
Yeah, that external awareness is really important, given particularly the dynamics of the environment that we're in, where things are changing rapidly, and we talked about climate and these other kinds of policy considerations, and while we do need to be independent of those, we also need to be aware of those because it changes what could be coming our way. And look, I think we've had pretty good NRC participation at a lot of ANS meetings over the years. We have a lot of people.
We can always do better, Mr. Chair. We can always do better.
We have a lot of people in the agency I know are ANS members. And I think and are involved in external working groups, which I think is really to the good. I think you'll see us speak at international conferences, but also domestic conferences, whether it's the Advanced Reactor Summit. I'm going to be pleased to see you guys at your winter meeting coming up. And so, senior leaders, I think, are leading by example on some of that too. And we also just hold a lot of public meetings where people can weigh in, they can speak, ask questions, express concerns. Some of those are going to be out at the plants. Some of those are going to be here in Rockville. But that external awareness is going to take different kinds of shapes, right? If you're up in our Regional 1 office where, we've got a number of decommissioning reactors and some other things going on, that public awareness situation is going to take a little different favor than if you're here in DC and you're in the middle of policy debates about the future of the industry and so on and so forth. So we're trying to encourage all of that.
Well, so last question. Who is Chris Hanson outside the office when he doesn't carry his chair's gavel around with him?
I don't have a portable gavel. It stays in the office. Well, I think the two most important things are I'm a husband and a dad. My wife Ann of 25 years she's a Presbyterian minister. She's worked in hospice and retirement communities. And as you might imagine, with a job like that, she helps me keep a lot of things in perspective. We have 3 sons. Our oldest is down in Texas. He's serving in the U.S. Army and training to be a physical therapist. Our middle son is down at Washington College, and he's on the rowing team and studying environmental science and having a blast. And our youngest he's a junior in high school. And both Ann and I have been pretty heavily in Boy Scouts over the years, helping him out and trying to help run the troop behind the scenes and so forth. So those are really the big things for me.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Chair Hanson, really appreciate it.
Craig.
It's been a good conversation,
Okay.
and look forward to having more of these as we go forward in the future. Thank you.
Thanks.